All right. So thank you for joining me this evening um, to talk about your chapter on credit recovery, exploring inequities, impacts, and solutions. Can you give us a brief overview of what credit recovery is and how it may look in schools?
Absolutely. So credit recovery is essentially the process of a student taking a course again, because the first time the student went through that course, they didn't pass it with a passing grade to earn a credit. So students all over the United States in public high schools need a certain number of credits in order to graduate. And that number of credits might be dispersed differently depending on their district. But the credit recovery process is essentially a process that lets that student go through the course again. So that might be through an online method, it might be an in-person, it could take place during summer school. And the student has the opportunity to redo either key aspects of the course or the course in total for that passing grade, hopefully the second time around.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. So it's almost like summer school. I used to frame summer school back in the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one way how credit recovery can look. So I think some of the most popular forms of it that at least I've seen in the literature are online programs. So the student might enroll in some type of online course during their school day. So that might be like a credit recovery room, and students of all grades are working on a variety of classes. Or it might be a summer school type of course. So the student goes and redoes the course for maybe a couple weeks in the summer. It could be with the same teacher, it could be with a different teacher, and has the opportunity to get, again, that passing grade to get that credit.
Okay, awesome. So as I was reading your chapter, one of the things that really stood out was, to me, a glaring statistic that in the 2018-19 school year, we had a 86% graduation rate across the nation. Kind of thinking back on that, I feel like there were some headlines really celebrating and applauding, the closure of the graduation gap and things like that. And I had a response both of celebrating those who did graduate and complete that milestone, because it's definitely a challenge, right? to finish all 12, 13 years of school. But then I was also really concerned about that 14% of individuals that didn't graduate. And I was wondering how we as educators failed to support them in meeting whatever need they had to meet the graduation requirements of their district. And then their prospects for survival, even if thriving would be possible, given that they don't have that very, very necessary high school diploma. Can you talk more about the nation's challenge with graduation rates?
Yeah. And I mean, to preference, again, I'm by no means an expert in this area. It's just an area I'm very passionate about because of my experience as an educator in high schools, where a lot of my students who were students with disabilities were not graduating from high school. They were dropping out beforehand. They were somewhat being pushed out, or they were being asked to take these credit recovery courses. Which I saw as a huge inequity at that time and still do. What I really see in still this graduation gap that we have are, and reading the literature and becoming more familiar with the dropout literature, we're losing a lot of students in those early high school years. So a lot of students who are not passing the entirety of 9th grade, the entirety of 10th grade, are those students who are at risk for not graduating on time. And what we know about those students who aren't passing all their courses in 9th and 10th grade is that they often also did not pass all of their courses in middle school. So there's a really high correlation between students who fail most of their courses in middle school and students who go on to continue to fail their courses in high school. And what we're missing there is, if a student is failing the class, then they're not getting the content. Something is preventing them from accessing that content. And my mind, which I was a special educator for 5 years, is, we're missing something there. Like the student needs access, and it's just a huge inequity that the student is not provided with the tools that they need to be successful in the classroom. And so when I think about high school dropout prevention and high school graduation rates, to me, that starts in middle school. to really making sure that our students in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade are getting all the tools that they need in order to be successful for their classes. And if there are any mitigating impacts that are impacting the student from succeeding in their classes, then we have systems in place as schools to identify those early on and put in supports to support that student.
Awesome. Thanks for that. I really like how you kind of drew us back to the root of middle school trouble, right? Because I think a lot of times when we think graduation, we only kind of focus at the high school level and probably that junior, senior-ish kind of range. But as a former, well, current actually now too, middle school teacher, I can kind of pick up signs like, oh, wait, you're going to need that skill for 4 years down the road. We got to make sure we get that. And I definitely would agree that it's about that access to the curriculum. Because that's often one of those barriers of engagement is I can't engage something I can't access. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
And then in your discussion on online learning, you mentioned that the What Works Clearinghouse, which is an agency that screens and reports the best practices in education, had only 3 studies to meet their standards. So their standards are pretty high for what makes, how would you word it? An appropriate study or appropriate intervention. Many of us I'll try that again. As many of us has experienced and continue to experience the disconnect between our technological advances of society and the education system's inability to use technology, especially in a fully remote situation, such as we were last year, to really appropriately support the needs of all learners at all times during the academic year. How do you think P12 systems can access and implement success with online education, similarly to how we've seen success in the post-secondary world?
Yeah, I thought this question was really interesting. And I wish I had a better answer for it. I have a hunch answer for it. I think just in time, we as educators, and I was teaching right at the start of the COVID shutdown. We were just kind of all thrown in to online learning very suddenly, and we're really having to learn on the fly, as we still are with, hybrid learning. And post-secondary institutions, they've had a lot of time they've had time to run studies on the best ways to support students. They've had time to implement different online learning platforms to see what students are accessing. And, they've been able, as a result, to get more research. And I think since it's just very new to K-12, I think it'll just take time. I know that the education community and research is committed to finding out what those best practices are and how to bring those down to students. I'm truthfully really excited to see how this, forced online learning can impact our schools. I think it is a great platform for differentiation. And I've had the pleasure of interacting with some teachers in my own personal teaching experience who use technology and hybrid learning in really cool ways to support perhaps students with severe anxiety who had trouble even accessing the school building. So I think it'll just take time, and I'm cautiously optimistic for where we might be able to go to better support all different types of students and learners.
It sounds like a great opportunity for the P12 system and the post-secondary system to connect even deeper beyond the graduation and college career readiness, but also to share, for post-secondary to kind of share their wisdom on how it worked for them. And so we don't have to repeat certain mistakes, right?
Yeah.
And then kind of continue and advance our educational system. I like that hunch that you had. It's another paper to explore that one. So you also reported that the What Works Clearinghouse didn't find any studies that met their standards exploring credit recovery. You did review 4 different studies where Heppen and colleagues in 2017 reviewed some studies, and they basically found that in terms of effectiveness of the course that they were looking at, which was an algebra course, 66% of the students in the online credit recovery class recovered their credit, whereas 78% who took the credit recovery class in face-to-face retrieved or recovered their credit.
Recovered, yeah.
Yeah, so it was interesting that pretty decent sized gap between those who just were online only versus the in-person. And then you have Rickles and colleagues in 2018 found no statistically significance in their three-year longitudinal study, but they did find differences between students who took online and face-to-face, similar to Heppen and colleagues. And then that the number of courses needed for graduation and the number of math courses passed within 4 years was really kind of dependent, or seemed to be a causal relationship between the environment in which the student learned, be it hybrid, remote or in person.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got Henrik and colleagues. They completed another longitudinal study that found that taking an online course and given the opportunity can increase the students' chances of graduating high school and enrolling in post-secondary education. And then they kind of looked at that cost benefit analysis, which was a very interesting discussion in your chapter that a lot of districts haven't quite maybe warmed up to the idea of the cost benefit analysis process for credit recovery and that online thing. Because if we look at the educational landscape, there's a lot of things going on, and it's kind of like, that's not that important right now. We'll get to it in a minute. But they did see that the online courses typically cost about 50% less than doing in person, which kind of makes sense because you're not paying for space and utilities and so on and so forth. And then we have, I'm probably going to butcher this name, Zweig and colleagues examine the impact of an online orientation to an online credit recovery program and their likelihood to complete that course. And there wasn't a huge or a statistically significant difference in course completion from those who took orientation to those who didn't. And it seems like, the research is kind of mixed. So there is definitely a chance, right, for more recovered credits if we offer some sort of credit recovery, be it in person or online. And it seems like kind of narrowing in on that, we're just not quite sure the best way. Is it in person? Is it online? Could it be that in between hybrid thing that we're kind of balancing as the educational system now in certain districts? What do you think we're missing in the credit recovery, graduation rates, that whole discussion in supporting students through graduation?
Yeah. So, this is a very heavy question. And I think that, it is one that kind of inspired my thinking behind the chapter and exploring this topic of credit recovery more. So again, in my experience, most of my students went to summer school for credit recovery. And that was because they didn't pass a few classes during the year. And our credit recovery at my high school system, it was 3 weeks. And so I was seeing, okay, these are some of my most vulnerable learners. They didn't get a lot of the content during the school year. And we see that through their grades. So now we're throwing them into kind of this crash course in 3 weeks where maybe they're getting 5 standards. And at least what I was experiencing was there's just a push to get them that credit. And we think, as educators, great, if we can get them to the next grade. And it's huge. And I think the tension that I struggle with and the tension that you bring up in your question is, there is this tension between graduation, which is so monumental and so important, and are we preparing students for a 21st century world? And I think as educators and as school systems, we can't just think about getting our students to the finish line. We just have to make sure that they're prepared. And so credit recovery, to me, I think is an interesting thing to explore in the context of your book, in which we're thinking about reframing these historically negative and inequitable educational systems, because it has been, at least as research says, mostly supporting marginalized groups of students since its founding. And we are continuing to see pay gaps. We're continuing to see employment gaps in STEM. And so our students, even if they are getting to high school, are not graduating with the skills that they need. And so I think in terms of your question, which is this relationship between credit recovery and graduation, is when we are supporting students in their credit recovery journey, we just have to think about, in that cost benefit analysis, long term, like, is this giving students the skills that they need long term to access this? And that's why I wrote and feel very passionately about early intervention, especially thinking about that 9th, 10th grade and middle school access. If students, if we focus perhaps that time instead on, giving targeted intervention, hiring that extra interventionist instead of hiring the credit recovery supervisor, could we bolster enough support for students in the school day so that they are getting the tools that they need to prepare them for graduation in math, literacy, history, and science?
Awesome. I think that really relates to your answer on the graduation rate, and what may be one of our challenges is that access piece. So it seems like if we start earlier, back in 6th, maybe even late elementary, right? Really, really, really making sure that every student can access every class every day, more or less. We all have bad days, but you get the idea. And then supporting that continued access through hopeful completion or graduation. And then also having that credit recovery for those life moments when school's is not the priority right now because I'm dealing with life, which is real. And I like how you kind of frame that, where we have to kind of also interrogate, how are we supporting access to credit recovery in a 3-week, very intensive course? Like, is that meaningful for when they get out? And then also, how can we even prevent that scenario from occurring, which in both seem to be rooted in that access piece. I like that. So to kind of wrap up our interview tonight, what are some of your recommendations at the school, maybe district, state, and federal level, that we can start to explore, maybe some of those hunches that you had earlier, to really start kind of working at a near 100% graduation rate, and then also how to weave in that access and credit recovery support?
Absolutely. So again, I feel very passionately about early intervention. And I saw it all too often where students got to high school and, they perhaps had a learning disability that, like, their middle school hadn't identified, or they needed a hearing aid because they had an auditory processing disability that their, elementary, middle school hadn't identified. And, it's not too late for us as educators to have systems in place in our schools, such as multi-tiered systems of support or response to intervention, PBIS. There's a whole multitude of these, school-wide intervention models right now. And I know the research is hazy on them, and especially implementing them at the secondary level. It comes with its own slew of challenges. Believe me, I know. I tried. But it just, if students aren't getting the tools that they need, if we as educators aren't supporting them in identifying any, discrepancy that could prevent them from accessing material, then we're not setting them up for success. And so my biggest recommendation would be, thinking about early intervention in middle school and 9th and 10th grade. In terms of credit recovery, what that can look like, I think, and there've been some really neat studies about this at the collegiate level, is having, different tiers of classes. So I think a challenge in high school, since we are very focused on, as a nation, STEM curriculums, challenging curriculums. And I mean, it's good. We want our students to be prepared for this ever-changing world at all times. At the same time, when we, as a nation, put in all of those courses, we pushed out a lot of courses that allowed more diversified access to high school curriculum. And so a neat way to build it in credit recovery wise would perhaps to have a 9th grade intervention math class, and students can earn that credit still. They're getting that algebra credit, but maybe that class is supported by an interventionist. Maybe it's also co-taught by a special education teacher. Maybe they use more manipulatives in the math class than the other algebra math class. I think there are ways where we can creatively engage credit recovery in our school system and really think about like equity and access. Are we giving students the tools that they need to move on to the next grade, to move on to post-secondary setting if they choose, while supporting them with filling in any skill gaps that they had? So a very long-winded answer, but I think at the heart, I just see early intervention as the best way to support students in getting to graduation and succeeding beyond graduation.
Definitely. I love that very long-winded or long-worded explanation you gave, because I think it really brought some pretty big kind of concepts up that we kind of step back and look at the educational field. We often don't see a lot of referral for special education evaluation after like 6th, maybe 7th grade. Teachers really stop looking for the disability and then start wondering, all right, what is it? They look at other ways, but we have to remember that maybe it just didn't show up in that other setting, or something in their life history could have happened to trigger whatever, right, discrepancy or difference there may be. And then also I loved how you framed the potential of the 9th grade class, where you're utilizing the expertise of the exceptional educator, right? Because we come into any learning environment with a massive bag of tools and strategies and ways to access almost anything. And then the content knowledge of the general education or typical education teacher, and pairing that in a way that's not the typical dichotomy of typical and exceptional child, but just we're all kind of figure out math because it's hard, and here's some extra manipulatives, and you got 2 people in here now, let's get it done. And really just removing any sort of hierarchy or anything like that, and just engaging with the material. So I really appreciate those 2 recommendations. Those are good reflective prompts tonight when I write in my journal. So thank you so much for taking the time this evening to talk about your chapter. And I can't wait to see it in print come January.
I'm really excited, and thank you so much for this opportunity. It was so exciting to read through all of the different abstracts for the first time, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what everyone has to contribute and what you have built. So congratulations.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You as well.